7.6 billion. Now that's a big number. That's how many people there are on Earth. In the U.S. alone, estimates say that out of 328 million, there are nearly 246 million lost souls. Men, women, boys, and girls that don't know Jesus. Those numbers seem big, but what if we were to focus on the number 1? The Bible tells us that heaven rejoices every time one person comes to know Jesus. What if we were to focus on the daily conversations, those everyday meaningful interactions for Christ that can truly make an eternal difference in someone's life? We can reach our nation with the gospel. We can reach the millions. We can reach our friends and family and neighbors by starting with one. Who's your one?
Love it. Hey, good morning, everybody. Good morning. Nice to see y'all. I was told somewhere along the way that you're supposed to start a sermon with a really good illustration, and I didn't have one. So this morning, on my way here, I was listening to a podcast. How many listen to podcasts? Anybody like podcasts? A few podcasts. That's good. I've started listening to some leadership podcasts, really helping me grow in my leadership and just learning what it might take that I don't have yet. But this morning I was listening to this one, Lisa Harper. You may have heard of her. She's new on K-Love, and it's the Back Porch podcast. And so she starts talking about this time where she went to this conference, and she's the speaker, and she is the day before the conference, and she meets this lady, and this lady's like, she's like, hey, what are you doing here? And she's like, well, I'm the worship leader. And she's like, oh, great, I'm a worship dancer, which she is not. She was just joking, having a good time like with this lady, but the lady didn't know that she wasn't a worship dancer. And the church that they were at is like, kind of an older, pretty staunch, just pews and just real proper. And so the first song goes by the next day at the conference, and the worship leader, she's got like a stand-up, an upright old wooden piano, and it's just a hymn. She plays a hymn, and then after the first song, she says, hey, I just want to let you guys know we got something really cool today. And on top of the piano is this big white package. And she goes, Lisa, would you come up here? She goes, we have a worship dancer that's here to bless us today with dancing. And she, knowing that she's not a worship dancer, she's like, well, now I'm called out. And she's the speaker. So she comes up to this thing, and they open up the package, and it's like a 6-foot flag that says Alpha and Omega, like on a big stick, right? And so she's like, well, it's now or never. I guess I got to learn how to be a worship dancer. So for the next few minutes, she goes back and forth on the stage with this flag, and she does this crazy dance, and she runs out of material after a couple minutes because she's not a worship dancer. And she does this bow and everything, and that has nothing to do with my message at all. But it was fun, and I hope you enjoy listening to podcasts. But maybe there is a tie-in, like maybe don't say things that you don't do, or that aren't true. But that was just for fun, because every Sunday is a fun day around here, and it's okay to have fun. If you have your sword with you and you want to follow along in your sword, we're going to be Micah chapter 2, 12 through 13. We're going to get there in a few minutes. We're also going to be in Luke 15. We're also going to be in Hebrews. You can catch up as we go along. But the first set of scriptures we will be in is Micah chapter 2, and that's 12 and 13. So I'm just going to give you my big idea in the beginning, kind of like you can start framing your mind around this thought, but how the Bible speaks of Jesus' followers as sheep. And it's in several places, but as God's sheep, we need to live in balance of being in the pen, which is fellowship with one another, and being out in the pasture, and that's on mission with Jesus. So Jesus says that he's called us both to gather in the pen, but he's also called us to go. And when we emphasize one over the other, our lives begin to be imbalanced, and they can be weak or limp and ineffective. And so as we think about this balance, we all tend to live in one way or the other. Most people aren't good at both. Most people don't want to do both. But as we think about this, we need to learn how to live in the tension of the balance between living in the pen and in the pasture. Because when we live in that balance, when we live in that tension, our lives become lives that create God space. They create space for God to work in the pen and out in the pasture, for a place for Jesus to be glorified in the pen and in the pasture. So Jesus, as believers, he's called us to live in community. Okay, this is my bungee cord here, given me by my good friend Kelly Moore. Thank you, Kelly. He has called us to live in community and fellowship with one another. Okay, that's over here on this side. He's also called us to live out in the pasture, to join him on mission for lost sheep. Now, we all tend to focus on just one side or the other. That's just how most of us live. We don't think about the other way. We either like being in the pen or we like being in the pasture. It's like if you're a pen Christian, okay? If you're a pen Christian, you love coming to church. Oh, baby, you love coming to church. Every Sunday, you are here. As soon as the doors are open, you're like, I'm there. I want to be there. You're here 5 days a week. You're in the morning. You know, you're leading every committee. You're a part of every team. You are amazing at being in the pen. That's where you prefer to be. You love spending time with other Christians. Okay? Well, if the reality is if you spend all your time in the pen, your life becomes weak. It's limp. It's ineffective, like this bungee cord. Now, some of you, you're a pasture Christian. You love being over here in the pasture. Oh, the world is what makes everything right to you. You would prefer to be out in the world. You would prefer to be spending time looking for lost sheep. You prefer to be outside of the pen. The pen kind of actually frightens you a little bit. You don't even want to be in the pen. You may have been in the pen once, but now you're in the pasture, and you love it. You love seeking and trying to win souls for the Lord. But if you spend all your time over here in the pasture, your ministry, your life becomes weak, becomes limp. It's ineffective. As believers. Now listen, if you're not a believer and you're hearing this message, this is what you're getting into. Okay, sometimes we don't talk about that enough, but if you're like, I don't know about this Christianity thing, I don't know about Jesus, I'm figuring out. This is what you're getting into. Okay? If you want to follow Christ, you have to live in this tension. Not one way or the other all the time. You have to live in this tension. You have to live in the tension between being a pen Christian, okay, and being a pasture Christian. Live in the tension. We have to gather together, but we have to go. We have to be in fellowship and be on mission. It is not one or the other. So we can be strong, effective Christians, sharing the gospel with the lost. Now, here's the thing. None of us are Jesus, right? None of us are Jesus. So Jesus was the only person to ever live in this tension perfectly. He knew exactly when to go and he knew exactly when to gather. He did it phenomenally. He's so good at this. We just, for whatever reason, we tend to lean towards one side or the other. So I want you to do a little introspective searching right now and ask yourself, do you prefer, be honest with yourself, okay? The Lord's watching you. Do you prefer to just hang out with other Christians and be where Christians are all the time? It's not a bad thing to be with Christians. I love being with Christians. I love being with people that follow the Lord. Is that your preference, or is your preference to be out in the pasture, to go on mission with Jesus out into the world? Which side do you lean towards? Do you like to spend more time in the pen or more time in the pasture? Both have their strengths and weaknesses. The Bible talks about this in the Old Testament. It talks about this in the New Testament in many places about us as people, as followers of Christ, as sheep. I want to look at Micah chapter 2, first off here. Micah chapter 2, 12 and 13. It's an Old Testament passage where we hear about us as sheep. I will surely assemble all of you, Jacob. I will surely gather the remnant of Israel. Talking about gathering God's people. I will put them together like sheep in the fold. And I love what the NLT, the New Living Translation, says here. It says, I will surely put them together like sheep in the pen, like a flock in the midst of its pasture. They will be noisy with men. The breaker goes up before them. They break out, pass through the gate, and go out by it. So their king goes on before them, and the Lord at their head. I've been trying to personally dive into more prophetic passages to try and understand some prophecy. Now, there's a lot of prophecy that's already come true. There's stuff that's yet to come true, and we're waiting on that, and we celebrate that has already happened. And this is one of these prophetic passages in Micah, talking about the end times. And when I started looking at it, I was like, well, I just kind of want to dive a little deeper. So I looked at like 5 different books of like these really smart people that write books, and they were all different on this. they all had different views and different ideas on this. So I was like, okay, I appreciate that. Thanks for writing a book. But one thing I want to point out is I noticed that God is the one who gathers the sheep. I will surely assemble all of you. I will gather the remnant of Israel. God is the one who gathers the sheep in the pen, and he's the one who leads out and protects in the pasture. A lot of times I think we forget that God's already in the pasture. We stick to the pen. Verse 13 talks about Jesus as the breaker, right? The breaker leading the way through the pen gate in the end times. Now, technically, I believe we are in the end times. I do. I think we've been in the end times for like 2,000 years. But Jesus is the one that leads out, and we get to follow him. So Jesus calls us into the pen for depth of relationship, for growth, and also out into the pasture to join him in seeking and saving that lost sheep. So the pen symbolizes, if you're not getting this, our gathering together. You are in the pen today. Okay, you with me here? Okay, give yourself a hand for being in the pen today. Thank you for joining us in the Pen online campus. Thank you for being in the online pen. Good job. Sunday is it's the most common pen day of the week. So I love it. I love that we have a day kind of set aside that we get to hang out in the pen together. Amen. Mm-hmm. So the Bible commands believers to gather together. We're going to look at Hebrews chapter 10. This is verses 24 and 25 if you're following along and you have your sword with you. Hebrews chapter 10, 24 and 25 says this, and let us consider how to stimulate one another to love and good deeds, not forsaking our own assembling together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near. This passage just tells us the importance, like how important it is to create that habit of gathering together instead of just not showing up. It's easy to not show up. It is. You guys know that. You've not showed up before. But it's hard to encourage each other when we're not together. And you remember over the last couple of years, there's been a pandemic, and we were all separated and in different spots, right? Like, especially a couple of years ago in the beginning. And in the beginning of this thing, people were really hurting. They were really alone. They were depressed, a lot of anxiety. And that can come from not gathering together. I heard this somewhere along the way, and I don't know if it was a teacher or a coach. I don't know who said it to me. But it stuck with me, and it said, when you show up, you grow up. When you show up, you grow up. And that's so many different areas, so many different fields. If when you show up to work, you grow up. You grow up to be a better worker, a better employee. And some of you, right now, understand exactly what that means because you're showing up and a quarter of the workforce isn't showing up. And so you're having to grow up because you're just having to take all their responsibilities. All the while, you're not getting any more money for that. You're just having to grow up. You're just having to learn to do more and having to expand your knowledge. Well, if you don't show up, you don't get to grow up in that way. If you don't show up to work, you don't get to grow up to be a good employee or a good worker. When you show up to school, right? When you show up to school, where are my students at? I saw a few of you out there. When you show up to school, you grow up to have a better education. When you show up, you grow up. When you show up on a sports team, when you show up to practice, you grow up. You start to learn skills. You learn how to work together. You learn to work as a team. You also have to learn how to work individually. You grow as an athlete when you show up to practice. When you don't show up to practice, and then all of a sudden maybe you do show up, guess what? The people that were showing up before you, they grew up while you were not there. And now you probably don't have a starting spot anymore. When you show up to church, when you show up in the pen, you grow up in the most important way possible, and that is spiritually. When you show up, you grow up in the ways of the Lord. Whether you're showing up at the online campus or whether you're here at the 747 pen, when you show up, you grow up. The psalmist in Psalms 52:9 says, I will trust in your good name in the presence of your faithful people. I love that. In the presence of your faithful people. Yeah, you can trust in the good name of the Lord on your own. You can. But that's not what the psalmist is saying. I will trust in your good name in the presence of your faithful people. Talking about fellowship and proclaiming the name of Jesus in the pen, together with other believers, in community. 2 Timothy 2:22 says this, now flee from your youthful lusts and pursue righteousness, faith, love, and peace with those who call on the Lord from a pure heart. We're called to pursue righteousness. Some of us here are still stuck in our youthful ways, our youthful desires. We haven't quite grown up in this yet. And this passage says that we are called to pursue righteousness with those who call on the Lord from a pure heart. Not all by yourself. Okay? We're getting this in the pen together. It says we are called to pursue faith with those who call on the Lord from a pure heart. It says we are to pursue love and peace with those who call on the Lord from a pure heart. Now, the context here, I think, is talking about fleeing the evil desires of our youth. And it's telling us, like, the way to do that is through righteousness, right? You can walk in righteousness, which is just walking in right living with God. Like, if you want to walk in right living with God, if you want to fulfill God's will, you have to do that by following Jesus with other people. It's very simple. Now, the same way that Jesus has called us to gather here in the pen, he also calls us to go out into the pasture, to join him. He's already there. To join him on his mission, because there are lost sheep out in the pasture. Just like every single one of you used to be a lost sheep out in the pasture, someone came along and said, hey, there's a pen full of people that I want to introduce you to. They're following the great shepherd. That lost pasture is where we need to go, the pasture where the lost sheep are. See, Jesus has called every single one of us to leave the comfort and the care that we have here in the pen to go out into the pasture so that we can give comfort and care to someone out there. We're going to look at Luke 15 here in just a minute. It's another passage where I love Jesus talking about us as sheep. And this passage, some of you have heard it, probably read it before. It's primarily, I believe, about the shepherding heart of God for the lost. But secondarily, I think it's also about the need for fellowship. It's the need for joining also the good shepherd on his search together, and then celebrating over those lost sheep that are found. Because see, as human people, how many human people here? Anybody human people? As human people, we celebrate the stuff that we value. We do. We celebrate the stuff that we value. And if we truly value sheep, if we truly value the lost, if we truly value people the way that Jesus values people, we get to celebrate with the shepherd when they're found. Let's look at Luke 15, verse 4 through 7. It says, "What man among you, if he has 100 sheep and has lost one of them, does not leave the 99 in the open pasture and go after the one which is lost until he finds it? When he's found it, he lays it on his shoulders, rejoicing. And when he comes home, he calls together his friends and his neighbors. He's saying to them, 'Rejoice with me, for I've found my lost sheep which was lost.' I tell you that in the same way there will be more joy in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous persons who need no repentance." Sheep, aka people, matter to the kingdom because the sheep matter to the king. The sheep matter to the good shepherd. And because they matter, we have to go after the lost sheep. This should be our heart. This has to be our heart, church. It's kind of lame saying, but if you care, you will share. Right? Like, it's true. If you care about lost people, about lost sheep, you will share. You need to maybe check yourself and say, well, of course I care, Pastor Matt. I always care. Well, does your life show that? Or is it just in your head? Do you know that you care, or does your heart care? Does your heart drive you to go out and share with the lost sheep? If we care, if we truly care with the heart of Jesus, we will go to great lengths. We will use every resource that we have to find a lost sheep. Just one. And then who knows how many more. Jesus mentions in this parable about leaving the many sheep in the open pasture. While he goes out and he searches, while the shepherd goes out and searches for the one that's lost and alone. See, aloneness for the sheep can be dangerous. And togetherness is usually safer. And Jesus knows that many sheep are better off together than they are all alone, like the lost sheep. Now, notice in this parable, this was something new to me that I didn't ever understand before as I read this. All of the sheep are already outside the pen. All of the sheep are living their life out in the pasture. And they're all together. Not here, but there, all together. And the one goes astray that gets lost. And the shepherd goes to find them, and they're all together. I have picture a very mature church body that says, you know what? We do need to go out into the pasture. I'm not going alone. Good, I don't want to go alone. You want to go? And I don't want to go. Let's go together. And get outside the pen into the pasture. Jesus makes it clear, of course, that we're not actually talking about sheep. You guys get that, right? We're talking about people. We're talking about sinners. We're talking about sinners that he's going after. Sinners are people that are loved. And it's Jesus, it blows me away the more you learn about him, the more I learn about him. Like, he truly, with everything that he had, loved sinners. He loved people that were outside the pen. The question or the challenge is, do we? Do we really love people that aren't in the pen? Do we love the guy at work that tells the dirty jokes every week? Do we love that guy? Or are we like, hey, I'm just going to steer clear of him. It's bad news. I can't be seen with him. He might be the most lost sheep that there is that needs to come into the pen. Jesus truly loves sinners. Do we actually love them? Do we love them? And if we don't, we have some heart work to do here in the pen. And that's okay. We're in the pen. That's where we can do the heart work. That's okay. Let's build each other up. Let's encourage each other. Let's figure out how we can learn to love in this way that Jesus loves sinners. Now, if you've ever been around somebody that was dying, and we've had too many people in the last couple of years that we've lost here from our church. But if you've ever been around someone that's about to pass and what they're going to say, like anybody that's around someone that's been through that, like you remember their last words. You remember what they have said in those final moments. And we've shared this every week in this series, The Great Commission. And even though we know Jesus is only leaving in physical form, leaving his disciples in physical form at that moment, we still have to pay special attention to what he says before he ascends to heaven. And it's Matthew 28, of course, 19 and 20. He says, therefore go. Go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I commanded you. And surely I'm with you till the end of the age. Jesus tells his disciples, he invites them to join him on his mission out in the pasture, to go. This is the most important thing that he has for you and for me to join him in, is to go out and seek lost sheep, to find lost sheep, to find sinners that need help. He tells us not to be afraid because he's given us his Spirit, not a spirit of fear. His Spirit, a spirit of strength and courage and love. When I knew that I was going to start talking about sheep and being in the pen and being in the pasture, the first thing I did was call a sheep farmer because I wanted to understand. I don't know anything about sheep, so I wanted to understand a little bit more about sheep. And the stuff that he told me was unbelievable. And I didn't tell him it was for a message. I was just like, hey, I'm interested. Can you share with me a little bit about what it's like to raise sheep in the pen versus sheep in the pasture? And some of the stuff he shared, I think will resonate with you. The very first thing he said, he goes, oh, well, a sheep in the pen, they're easy to catch. I was like, huh. He goes, well, also just a sheep that's in the pasture is very hard to catch. I started thinking about that because obviously I know what I'm working on and he's just telling me stuff. I'm like, we need to understand that when we go out into the pasture, which all of us, if you're following Christ, will have to do at some point, like it's not going to be easy to catch a lost sheep, right? They're out wandering around. Head stuck in the electric fence, looking over there. They don't know what's happening. Like we get a chance to go out. In the pen, easy to catch. He said, in the pen, sheep have more human contact. And I would agree. We gather in here in the pen, and we're around each other, and we're hanging out together. And the sheep out in the pasture, he said, they shy away from people. And how many sinners do we know that, if we approach them with some kind of weird Christianese and we're like, you want to be washed in the blood or something, like, what are you talking about? Like, easy, or are we just smacking people with Bibles? Like, guys, they're not used to the same vocabulary that we talk about in the pen. We have to talk their language. We have to be around them so we can understand what they're doing. And, a sheep, he said, out in the pasture, he goes, if you run up on a sheep out in the pasture, they're gone. You have to, kind of ease your way in a little bit sometimes. And they're like, what's that? Oh. He said, this was good. He said, in the pen, he said, this is where the bottle feeding happens. And I was like, ooh, doggy, I wish you were writing this sermon, because I'm sitting here thinking about how many of us have been in the pen on our spiritual milk for our entire lives. We have been getting bottle fed forever and ever. And we've never stepped out in the pasture. We are still on the bottle, right? We haven't started to taste the meat. As believers, again, if you're not a believer, we want you to come in here and experience the bottle feeding. We do. We want to feed you. We want to encourage you. We want to give you the spiritual milk so you can start to understand some things. But as a believer, if you've been a believer for a long time and you've only been on the milk, it's time to grow up. Now, I want to make sure you understand. I didn't tell him this was for you guys. He was just telling me about pen and pasture sheep. And he said the sheep in the pen are fatter. And what he was getting at for those sheep is they get lazy. You know, and it is a reality. We spend our time here and we get comfortable. The sheep out in the pasture running around, causing problems, hanging out, exercising, doing things. And that's all I'm going to say about that. And he said, we were winding down and he said, you know, Matt, he goes, it's actually not natural for a sheep to stay in the pen. And I was like, woo. How many of us need to know that we are not doing it God's way, which is the natural way, and that we've been sticking around in the pen, but we should have enough strength and encouragement to step out. Such a good conversation with him, and we were about done, and he says, Matt, you know, one more thing. He says, really? He goes, sheep don't even need to be in the pen unless they need help. I was like, what if our pen was the place where people came for help? And we were like, we were there for them. We saw it because maybe they were stuck in the electric fence when we found them, right? And they need a Band-Aid, they need a little courage, they need a little doctoring up, they need a little prayer, you know? So we bring them in to the pen for help. And then guess what happens when they get in the pen for help? Yeah, let's give them some of that spiritual milk. Let's start feeding them, start getting them some of that, you know, baby food so that they can grow up and then they can head out into the pasture later. Because they soon remember, I was just in the pasture. That guy came and saved me from the electric fence. He said we don't need to be in the pen unless they need help. I would love for this place to be a place of help, where someone comes in from the pasture that we've never met before, we've never seen before, and we just love them. Pray for them, encourage them, hang out with them. Jesus says in John 4:34, he says, my food is to do the will of him who sent me and to finish his work. Our strength and our nourishment comes from doing the will of God. If you are feeling like you don't have any spiritual strength, you're feeling like you're just weak and ineffective and limp, it may be because you are not living in God's will. Plain and simple. If you're gravitating just towards one or the other and you've never experienced the pasture, you've never experienced the pen, you're not living in God's will. You need to be in the tension of both. That's where our nourishment should come from. When we're living in the balance of regularly gathering together with our fellow brothers and sisters and encouraging, which means to put courage in. Some people need you to make a little courage deposit in their life. You just encourage. When we're doing that, gathering with our brothers and sisters, and when we're living in the world, intentionally looking for opportunities to share, then we fulfill God's will. So what side are you on most of the time? I prefer the pasture. I do. I want my life to be a 75% pasture, 25% pen. But I don't want it to go any more than that. Because I know personally when I come into this pen, because I believe we have an amazing pen church. I really do. I think we have an amazing pen church. You are for me. When I come in here, I get an encouraging word. I get a hug. I get somebody's telling me about a win that's happened spiritually in their life. I love that in the pen. But I'm just kind of wired that way. I just kind of want to go. I just want to go. As a student ministry, the last few months, we have been talking about being oh so fat. Okay? Oh so fat. And what does that mean? It means one step of faith at a time. One step of faith at a time. Oh, so fat. We love it. That comes from Hebrews 11:6. And I don't know if you guys know this verse. It says, it is impossible to please God without faith. Impossible. Not like you could do a little bit. It is impossible. And so what we're working on as a student ministry is, what is the one step of faith that I need to make today so that I can be living in God's will? Is my step of faith, I've only been to the pen one time in 2 months, and so my step of faith is, I'm going to commit to 2 times a month. I'm going to go to the pen. And then maybe it's, okay, I'm going to commit to 3 times a month. That's my step of faith, is to get into the pen. Or maybe their step of faith is to get out of the pen. But I don't want you to freak out and think that your one step of faith, if you're here in the pen, your one step of faith doesn't have to be this giant leap out into the pasture. That's not necessarily true. Your step of faith might be to dive into God's word deeply every single day so that you can understand what he has for you, the love that he has for you, and you could know how to encourage the next person that comes in because you know God's love. Your one step of faith, if you're in the pen, it might be to notice somebody that's not here. Like you've noticed, they used to sit in that area right there, and I haven't seen them in like 3 months. I wonder what happened to them. Your one step of faith could literally be to call them. Hey, missed you in the pen. Pen, what are you talking about? Hey, I'm glad you asked. Open up a conversation. Fantastic. Your one step of faith might be to, as soon as this is over today, is to talk to your spouse and say, hey, I'm sorry about that thing that I did. That might be a big step of faith. Your step of faith, maybe you are in the pen and you've been in the pen your whole life, and your feet are you're up on the fence, right? And you're kind of checking out what's happening on the other side of the fence. So your next step is literally to go across the gate, go through the gate, across the fence, and then you get outside and you're looking around, and maybe there's a sheep right behind you, and you're like, come on, we got to get out of that. Maybe that's your step of faith. Maybe someone's waiting for you to lead the way outside the pen. Maybe you're already outside the pen. Maybe you're in the pasture. You don't know what your step of faith is. You're just like, I've been out in the pasture for like 3 years, and I don't know. It's kind of weird in the pen. The people are weird in the pen. They look at me funny every time I come in, and the language I use isn't the language they use. And maybe your step of faith is to find another lost sheep that's out there. And so then you create a relationship outside the pen. I don't know. Maybe it is your step is to jump back into the pen so that you can be encouraged and loved on. Maybe your one step of faith is to find your person that you need to be praying for the Who's Your One campaign. Maybe your one step of faith is, there is that guy at my office that, oh man, he's that guy. He's the water cooler conversation guy, right? And you're like, it's so uncomfortable. So maybe your step of faith is to start praying for him, so you write his initials on your ball here today before you leave. And you come and you drop it into the container, and then you start to pray for that person every day. Maybe that's your first step. Maybe you've been praying for someone already, praying for them all the time, and maybe your next step is, today is the day I'm going to share the gospel with them. I don't know how to do that, but that's what I need to do. Hey, come find one of your pastors. We want to do that with you. 100%. Any chance to share the gospel, we are in for that. We have some tools for that. Maybe that's your next step. I don't know what your first step is, but I do believe that every single day there is a step that we can take, whether it's in the pen or outside the pen. And it's going to be different for all of us. Will you guys pray with me?